The smell of diesel fuel and steel still clings to my clothes, even though I retired from the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railway 3 years ago. 42 years of coupling cars, checking brake lines and riding the rails through Iowa winters. And now, here I sit in Danielson's funeral home on First Avenue in Cedar Rapids, trying to make sense of how a man's life can be reduced to a folded flag and a room full of people who barely knew him. My son Tommy was gone at 53, taken by a heart attack in his sleep. And his wife Patricia stood at the casket receiving condolences in her black designer dress that probably cost more than I'm in a month back when I was still working the yards, I watched her dab at her eyes with a handkerchief that never seemed to actually touch her face. Watched her lean into the sympathy of strangers while I sat in the third row like a ghost at my own son's funeral. You work the rails long enough. You learn to read the weight distribution in a train. Know when something's off balance before it derails. I should have seen the signs in my own family. Should have noticed when Patricia started managing all of Tommy's calls home. When our Sunday dinners became monthly. Then quarterly. Then stopped altogether except for obligatory holiday appearances, where she'd sit in my living room checking her phone, while Tommy and I tried to find conversation across the canyon she'd carved between us. The house still smelled like the pot roast I'd learned to make after Martha passed 8 years ago. My wife's recipe card still taped to the kitchen cabinet. Yellowed and splattered with evidence of my attempts to keep her memory alive through food. Tommy used to love that pot roast. Would drive the 20 minutes from Marion just to have Sunday dinner. Back before Patricia convinced him they needed to move to that new development in Robbins weather. Houses all looked like they were, stamped from the same mold. Working the railway teaches you about connections. How every coupling has to be secure or the whole train falls apart. I'd spent my life making sure those connections held, checking every link, tightening every bolt, and somehow I'd let the most important connection in my life rust away, the funeral director. Pete Morrison, whose father I'd worked with back in the 70s, had asked me about the eulogy, and Patricia had stepped in before I could answer. Her voice sweet as antifreeze when she said Harry wouldn't be comfortable speaking in front of all these people, that she'd handle everything. These people were mostly her friends from the country club, her real estate office, her yoga studio in Marion where she paid $60 a class to stretch in a heated room, Tommy's real friends. The guys he'd grown up with here on the southeast side. The ones who'd helped him rebuild his first car in my garage. They stood in the back looking as out of place as I felt. The moment that broke something inside me came after the service. When people were filing past the casket for a final goodbyes, Patricia stood there like a grieving widow from Central Casting, accepting condolences with practiced grace, and when old Jim Kowalski from the rail yard came up to pay his respects, she actually asked who he was. Jim, who'd known Tommy since he was 5, who'd given him his first baseball glove, who'd been at every one of his little league games when I had to work late. That's when I knew my son had been living 2 lives, the one Patricia allowed people to see and the one she'd systematically erased. But it was when she turned to her sister Linda, not even lowering her voice enough, and said those words that would echo in my skull for weeks afterward, that everything crystallized into perfect, horrible clarity. At least I don't have to pretend to care about his father anymore, she said, dabbing at those dry eyes again. The old man actually thinks Tommy was going to leave him something. He left you nothing, Harry. Nothing. The house, the accounts, the life insurance. It's all mine. Maybe now you'll understand that Tommy chose his real family. She said it with a little smile, the kind that reminded me of finding a cobhead in the woodpile. Beautiful and deadly, the words hit me like a coupling pin to the chest. The kind of blow that doesn't just knock the wind out of you, but changes the shape of your skeleton. I stood there in my one good suit, the one Martha had helped me pick out 20 years ago for our daughter Sarah's wedding, and felt something I hadn't felt since I was 19 and fighting in Vietnam. That cold clarity that comes when you realize you're in enemy territory and nobody's coming to save you. The drive back to my house on the southeast side took me past the rail yards where I'd spent most of my adult life. The familiar rhythm of wheels on track playing through the cherries is open. Window like a song I knew by heart. The house sat on Bever Avenue, a 1950 Tarrant style that Martha and I had bought for $8,000 in 1971, back when young families could afford to dream. Now Patricia called it outdated. Said the neighborhood was declining. Suggested more than once that I should sell it and move into one of those assisted living places out by the interstate. I was 71. Not dead. Still split my own firewood. Still climbed ladders to clean the gutters every fall. Still had the grip strength from decades of throwing switches and coupling cars that could crack. Walnuts bare-handed, but to Patricia, I was already a ghost. Had been for years, just waiting for someone to make it official. That night I sat in Tommy's old room, and changed since he'd left for college 35 years ago. His Iowa Hawkeyes pennant still on the wall, his baseball, trophies dusty on the shelf. The cedar chest at the foot of his bed held things Patricia didn't even know existed. Little League uniforms, report cards. The Father's Day cards he'd made me in elementary school with construction paper and too much. Clue, I pulled out a photo from 1985. Tommy at 15, standing next to me at the rail yard on Take Your Kid to Work Day. His smile wide and genuine. Before life got complicated, before Patricia. Before the distance that grew between us like Johnson grass through railroad ties. Something about that photo nagged at me, the way Tommy's hand rested on my shoulder. Protective almost. Like he was the father and I was the son needing reassurance. The next morning brought a knock at my door that changed everything. Stood there. Was a young woman in a business suit. Couldn't have been more than 30. Holding a leather briefcase and looking nervous. Mr. Nelson, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Brennan and Associates. I was your son Thomas's attorney. I have some documents he asked me to deliver to you personally. After the funeral, she glanced round like she was checking for surveillance and something in my gut. That same instinct that had kept me safe on the rails for decades. Told me Patricia didn't know about this visit. I invited her in. Made coffee in the percolator that had been making the same bitter brew since 1978, and watched her lay out papers on my kitchen table with the kind of careful precision that told me these weren't just documents. They were evidence. Your son came to me 6 months ago, she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. He was concerned about certain financial irregularities in his accounts. He hired me to investigate quietly, and to ensure that his wishes were properly documented regardless of what might happen. She pulled out a document that made my hands shake as I read it. A trust, dated 3 months ago, leaving the house on Bever Avenue in an irrevocable trust for me for the rest of my life. Then to Sarah's kids, my grandchildren who Patricia had never even met. Another document showed Tommy's actual will, not the one Patricia had been waving round, but one that specifically excluded her from his union pension, his railway retirement benefits that he'd inherited rights to from my service, and most importantly, a life insurance policy she didn't know existed, purchased through the Brotherhood of Railway Workers, naming me as sole beneficiary. Asterisk, the real revelation came in Tommy's letter, handwritten in that careful script he'd learned at Catholic school, the words flowing like a confession he'd been holding back for years. Dad, if you're reading this, Then I'm gone and Patricia has probably already shown her true colors. I've known for 5 years what she really is. Known since I overheard her on the phone with her sister calling you a burden. Saying she was counting the days until you were gone so she could sell your house and use the money for her real estate ventures. I stayed because I'm a coward, because divorce would have meant losing everything I'd worked for, and because I thought I could protect you better from inside the marriage. Every time she told you I was too busy to visit, I was usually sitting in the parking lot of Casey's General Store, forbidden to come see you. Every Christmas gift, every birthday card that seemed impersonal, she chose them, the ones I picked out, she threw away. Jennifer pulled out more papers, credit card statements showing purchases Patricia had made in Tommy's name without his knowledge, property transfers she'd forged his signature on. A systematic draining of accounts that looked like financial abuse clear as day. Tommy had been building a case for divorce, had been documenting everything. When his heart gave out, he was under tremendous stress, Jennifer said quietly. He came to my office 3 days before he died, said he felt like something was going to happen to him. I told him he was being paranoid. But he insisted on finalizing everything immediately. She showed me security footage from her office building, Tommy looking haggard, checking over his shoulder as he signed documents, looking like a man who knew his time was running out. Asterisk, the weight of truth settled on my shoulders like a fully loaded grain car, heavy but somehow steadying, giving me purpose I hadn't felt since Martha's funeral. Jennifer Walsh sat in my kitchen for 3 more hours that morning, walking me through every document Tommy had prepared, every safeguard he'd put in place, and with each revelation, I felt something shifting inside me like tectonic plates grinding against each other before an earthquake. The boy I'd raised, to be honest, had been fighting a war I didn't even know existed, protecting me from behind enemy lines while I sat here thinking he'd abandoned me for Patricia's world of marble countertops and homeowner associations. The guilt of that misunderstanding burned in my chest like creosote in an old chimney, black and choking, but underneath it, something else was building. Something that felt like the controlled fire we used to clear the right-of-way along the tracks. Jennifer left me with a box of documents and a business card, telling me to call if Patricia tried anything. But I knew Patricia better than she thought. Working the rails teaches you about momentum, how a train going 60 miles an hour takes a mile to stop even with emergency brakes, and Patricia had been building her momentum for years. Wouldn't stop just because some papers said she had to. Sure enough, 2 days later she showed up at my door, still wearing black like she was auditioning for the role of grieving widow, demanding to know why the railway pension office had rejected her claim. The morning sun caught her face in a way that showed every line her Botox couldn't hide, and for the first time, I saw her clearly, not as my son's wife, but as what she'd always been. A parasite that had attached itself to my family and slowly drained us dry. You did something, she hissed, pushing past me into my living room, her eyes scanning for evidence like she expected to find legal documents spread across my coffee table. That pension was mine. Tommy promised me everything would be mine, the way she said it, possessive and cold. Made me think of how I'd watched a switching error once send a whole line of tanker cars off the rails, the kind of disaster that happens when someone thinks they know better than the safety protocols. I stood there in my doorway, feeling the weight of my father's railroad watch in my pocket, the one he'd carried through 40 years of service, the one I'd carried through my own time on the rails. The one Tommy had always admired, but Patricia had called worthless junk. Tommy left you the house in Robbins, I said, my voice steady as a rail on good ballast. Seems that should be enough for a grieving widow. The sarcasm tasted foreign in my mouth, but good, like the first beer after A long shift in August heat. Patricia's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion to anger to something that looked like panic when she realized I knew more than she'd expected. She started talking fast then. About funeral expenses, about debts I knew Tommy didn't have, about how family takes care of family. And that's when I laughed. Actually laughed out loud for the first time since Tommy died. Because hearing her talk about family was like listening to a fox preach vegetarianism to the chickens. That afternoon, I drove out to the cemetery in my truck. The one Patricia always said embarrassed her when I'd park it in their driveway. A 1990 for a Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles and a transmission that still shifted smooth as butter because I'd maintained it like everything else in my life. With careful attention and respect for things built to last, Tommy's grave was still fresh, the dirt mounded and covered with that artificial grass they used to make death look prettier. And I stood there talking to my boy like I should have been able to do for the last 5 years. I told him about Jennifer's visit, about the documents, about how I understood now what he'd been trying to do, and somehow, standing there in the October wind with leaves falling like confetti at a parade nobody wanted to attend, I felt him, there with me, felt his approval in the way the wind shifted. Carrying the smell of the railway from across town. Sarah flew in from Denver that evening. My daughter who'd kept her distance from Patricia by keeping her distance from everything. And when I showed her Tommy's letter, she broke down crying in the way Patricia never had, real tears that left her face splotchy and her nose running. I knew something was wrong. She kept saying, I knew it, but Tommy always insisted everything was fine. We sat at my kitchen table until midnight, going through everything Jennifer had left. And Sarah, who'd inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's understanding of how leverage works, started making calls to people she knew, a forensic accountant in Des Moines, a private investigator in Chicago who specialized in financial fraud. Building our own case with the methodical precision of a railway engineer plotting a route through mountain passes, the private investigator Sarah hired, a former IRS agent named Marcus Webb, found things in 2 weeks that turned my stomach sour as spoiled milk. Patricia had been married before, twice, both husbands dying young, one from a heart attack at 51. Another in a car accident that the insurance company had investigated but couldn't prove was anything. In more than bad luck on black ice, she'd walked away from both marriages significantly wealthier, had changed her name each time, moving from state to state like a traveling disease. The pattern was clear as signal lights on a dark track. And suddenly Tommy's heart attack at 53 didn't seem like the random tragedy I'd been mourning. Marcus sat in my living room with his laptop, showing me document after document, a trail of devastation Patricia had left across the Midwest like a tornado that knew exactly which houses to hit. The forensic accountant found more accounts in the Cayman Islands, property transfers that happened while Tommy was supposedly on business trips he'd never taken, signatures that didn't match when you looked close enough. She'd been bleeding him dry for years, but smart about it, small enough amounts that he might not notice, or if he did, she'd have an explanation ready about investments, about their future, about building their empire. Together, it added up to nearly $300,000, money that should have been Tommy's security, his retirement, his legacy to his children if he'd ever had any, which Patricia had made sure never happened with excuses about timing, about her career, about everything except the truth that children would have been witnesses she couldn't control. Sarah, and I met with Jennifer Walsh and the county prosecutor, a young woman named Rebecca Chen who listened to our evidence with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd seen this before, maybe too many times. Elder abuse, financial fraud, forgery. She listed off the charges like items on a grocery list. With what you've gathered, we can build a strong case. But Mrs. Nelson needs to make a mistake. Needs to do something that shows intent. I thought about Patricia's desperation when she'd come to my house, the panic in her eyes when she realized the pension was gone. And I knew exactly what kind of mistake she'd make. She'll come after the house, I said, certain as sunrise. She's been wanting this land for years, keeps talking about how valuable it'll be when they develop this area. She'll try to prove Tommy promised it to her, or that I'm not competent to manage my affairs. Sure enough, 3 days later I was served with papers challenging my mental competency, filed by Patricia as concerned family seeking to protect an elderly relative who was showing signs of dementia. The papers claimed I'd been confused at the funeral, that I'd forgotten important dates, that I was living in unsafe conditions and needed immediate intervention. The lies were so bold they took my breath away, but Rebecca Chen smiled when she read them. The kind of smile I'd seen on switchmen's faces when they knew exactly which track a runaway car was heading. Down. She just committed perjury, Rebecca said. We have security footage from the funeral home, witnesses to your mental state, and now we have her sworn statement contradicting provable facts. This is what we needed. The competency hearing was set for the following Tuesday at the Lynn County Courthouse, a limestone building downtown where I'd registered my marriage to Martha in 1969, where we'd adopted Sarah in 1973, where I'd filed the papers after Martha's death that felt like signing my own heart away. Patricia showed up in a conservative suit, trying to look like a concerned daughter-in-law, even manufactured some tears as she told the judge about my declining condition. How I'd been forgetting to eat, living in squalor, making irrational decisions about Tommy's estate. Each lie she told was another spike in the rail, and Jennifer Walsh let her talk, let her build her story higher and higher like a house of cards in a wind tunnel. When it was my turn to respond, I didn't need to say much. Jennifer presented the evidence methodically. Security footage showing me clearly lucid at the funeral. Testimonies from neighbors about my daily routine. My volunteer work at the Railway Museum, where I still conducted tours every weekend, teaching kids about the history of the rails that built Cedar Rapids. Then she presented Tommy's trust documents, his real will, and finally, the evidence of Patricia's previous marriages. Her pattern of behavior, the forensic accounting that showed systematic theft. I watched Patricia's lawyer, some slick operator from Des Moines she'd probably promised a percentage to, slowly realize his client had lied to him about everything. Watched him lean away from her at the defendant's table like she was radioactive. Asterisk though. Judge Harold Fitzgerald, a man I'd actually gone to high school with back when Cedar Rapids was smaller and everybody knew everybody, looked at Patricia over his reading glasses with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your boot, Mrs. Nelson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years on the bench. Not only do I find no evidence of incompetence in Mr. Nelson, but I find substantial evidence of attempted fraud, perjury, and elder abuse on your part. I'm dismissing your petition with prejudice and referring this matter to the criminal division. Patricia's face went white as fresh snow, then red as a signal light, and she started to speak. But her lawyer grabbed her arm, whispered urgently in her ear, probably telling her that anything she said now would only dig the hole deeper. But Patricia couldn't help herself. Never could when she wasn't in control, and she stood up, pointed at me across the courtroom, and screamed. He turned Tommy against me. That old bastard poisoned my marriage. Tommy was going to leave me, and it's his fault. The bailiff moved toward her, but she kept going. Years of careful manipulation exploding like a boiler with too much pressure and no release valve. I earned that money. I owned that house. Do you know what it's like living with someone who talks about his precious father every single day? Who kept trying to drag me to Sunday dinners in that pathetic little house. I gave Tommy class. I gave him status. And this is how I'm repaid. Sarah grabbed my hand as Patricia melted down completely, admitting to things we hadn't even accused her of yet. Talking about the pills she'd been slipping into Tommy's coffee to make his heart race, about the stress she'd deliberately caused to trigger his condition, about how she'd done it before and gotten away with it. Judge Fitzgerald ordered her arrested right there in his courtroom, and as the bailiffs cuffed her, she looked at me with such hatred that I actually felt sorry for her. The way you feel sorry for a rabid dog that used to be somebody's pet before the sickness took hold. The last thing she said before they led her away was, "He left you nothing because you're nothing," still trying to hurt me with words that had lost all their power. The truth was, Tommy had left me everything that mattered, not just the trust, not just the insurance money that would keep me comfortable for whatever years I had left, but the knowledge that my boy had loved me all along, had fought for me, had died trying to protect me from someone who'd seen our family as nothing but a resource to be strip-mined. The district attorney, after reviewing all the evidence, charged Patricia with murder in the second degree, 3 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and enough other charges that her lawyer, who turned out to be court-appointed after she couldn't access any of the frozen assets, told her to take a plea deal for 25 years. She'll be 73 when she gets out, if she lives that long, and everything she thought she'd stolen had been returned to Tommy's real family. I still go to the cemetery every Sunday, bringing flowers from Martha's garden that I've kept alive all these years, yellow roses that bloom despite the Iowa winters, stubborn and beautiful like everything worth keeping in this life. I tell Tommy about the Railway Museum, about the kids who come through why died at the old engines, about how Sarah's moved back to Cedar Rapids to be closer, about how his cousins from Chicago came down for Thanksgiving and we filled the house with the kind of laughter Patricia had tried to silence. Sometimes I think about her in the women's correctional facility in Mitchellville. Wonder if she thinks about Tommy, about me, about the life she could have had if she'd just been capable of actual love instead of whatever broken thing lived inside her instead. Last week, I got a letter from one of Patricia's previous victims, the daughter of her first husband, thanking me for finally stopping her, for doing what their family couldn't prove, for giving them closure they'd waited 15 years to find. She told me her father had been a good man, a carpenter from Minneapolis who'd built beautiful furniture and loved his family, who'd died confused and heartbroken, convinced his children had abandoned him when really Patricia had been intercepting their calls, blocking their visits, isolating him just like she'd done to Tommy and me. We talk on the phone now sometimes, comparing notes, finding comfort in shared grief and shared victory, understanding that justice doesn't bring back the dead, but it does honor their memory. The house on Beaver Avenue stands solid as ever, filled with photographs Patricia had tried to pack away, Tommy's baseball trophies back on display, Martha's china in the cabinet where it belongs. Sarah and I are planning to turn Tommy's room into a study, keep his memory alive but make new memories too, the kind Patricia never understood were the real wealth of a life well lived. If you're reading this from wherever you are, maybe you recognize some part of this story. Maybe you've got your own Patricia, someone who mistakes kindness for weakness, who sees family as something to exploit rather than something to cherish. All I can tell you is what 42 years on the rails taught me, that every switch you throw changes the direction of the journey, and it's never too late to throw the right one. Even if you have to fight through hell to reach it, Tommy threw that switch when he walked into Jennifer Walsh's office 6 months before he died, and in the end, His love was stronger than Patricia's greed, his protection more lasting than her manipulation, and his father's dignity worth more than Walder. Money she'd tried to steal. He left me everything, and she ended up with exactly what she deserved, which was nothing at all.